I think the problem with some people in Morton, said Jackie, sipping from a pint of stout that was the colour of tar and likely tasted similar,
is that they think like people from Morton.
Placing the pint carefully back on the beer mat, he wiped the foam from his moustache and allowed the words to hang for a moment in the air like smoke gently ascending from a candle. Having allowed the statement to percolate for a moment and having not received any argument from the assembled group of listeners, he decided to continue. Jackie was famous for his stories, though he was a Morton resident through and through, having been born in the town and lived much of his life there. He had also spent a significant chunk of his adult life overseas. According to Diane, the gravel-voiced barmaid at the Anchor, he had been around the world more times than Marco Polo. It was for that reason that he was considered something of a sage by those who had never really been outside of Morton for any length of time. It was also the reason why at times Jackie seemed frustrated by the parochial attitudes and bristling undercurrent of xenophobia that sometimes reared its head in the tiny town.
You see, it makes me want to scream when I hear people who've never been further than the edge of Acres Wood pontificating about the world at large, telling me how things are or ought to be for people in countries they couldn't even spell, never mind point to on a map. Honestly, some of the tripe I hear spoken in here on a Friday night makes my blood boil. But I guess it's natural, small town mentality. Did I ever tell you about when I was in Cambodia with Eddie Dembro, who used to live up on Lime Street?
He asked, to none of us in particular and all of us at once. We were a small group that night. Around 6 of us regulars, sitting at the bar, swapping stories, joking and jibing at one another the way that longtime friends will. With that particular question, we knew it was time to get settled. The phrase, "Did I ever tell you?" coming from Jackie, almost certainly means that whether he had or hadn't, he was about to, and a story was coming your way in the very near future. As it happened on that particular day, the story was a new one for me. I'd never heard Jackie talk about Cambodia and had only ever heard of Eddie Dembro in passing. I don't mind admitting that the fact that he was someone generally referred to in the past tense had me intrigued. Those was people, the ones spoken of in terms of he was, she was, or he used to, when spoken about in Morton, are either dead or moved away, and I knew that either possibility would naturally come with a tail attached. As I was to find out, Eddie had not moved away.
About 1980 it was.
Jackie began.
Him and me were in the Merchant Navy at the time, and we'd been all over that part of the world. Southeast Asia. Beautiful place if you ever get the chance to see it. Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Thailand. Stunning, stunning places. Anyway, there's one place in Cambodia called Angkor Wat. Nowadays it's a fairly popular tourist place. My grandkids have been there, and you see it all over social media, but to us, as lads from Morton in the 80s, long before there was an internet and before you'd get a National Geographic anywhere but the library, it was a revelation. Angkor Wat used to be the centre of a kingdom centuries ago, like the big power in the region. When the civilization went under, they left all their building, their temples, and these massive ornate structures behind. Now obviously Cambodia is a heavily forested place, so over time, the jungle just reclaimed it. The trees grew up, and around the structure, the temples have these huge trees with roots and vines squirming through the brickwork. It's like something out of the Tarzan films we used to watch as kids.
As Jackie was saying this, Mike, another of our friends, was bringing up photos of this mythical-sounding place on his phone. This being the 21st century when even the troglodytes in Morton had access to what Mike referred to as the interwebs, he found it fairly quickly.
"Bloody hell,"
he exclaimed, looking at photos of the temples wrapped up in the clutches of overlapping vines.
"You've actually been there. It doesn't even look real."
He held up for examination an image of what looked to be an ancient stone-built temple. In the foreground was a sculpted stone head the size of a family car. The walls behind were covered all over with elaborate, detailed carvings, and around and above it all, the jungle green and creeping grasp.
"Yeah,"
said Jackie.
"I've been a few times, but this is what's interesting."
He took the phone from Mike's hand and quickly typed in a related search.
So around the walls of these places, there are carvings, right? They're gods, they're kings and heroes, and the animals they saw in the jungle. There's buffalo and birds and snakes and all sorts of things. But on one panel, on one little disc in one room of this temple, there's something else.
He flipped around the phone to show carvings. One showed what was clearly a large bird, another showed a buffalo, and the top one what looked to be...
"Is that..."
Mike began.
Is that a bleeding dinosaur?
Jackie raised his eyebrows and then smiled.
Looks like a stegosaurus, doesn't it?
I'll admit that I was stunned. The obvious questions jumped from our mouths in chorus. How the hell did this civilization know what a stegosaurus looked like? There were no reference books then. No way they could have referred to notes about dinosaurs. Surely the only frightening conclusion was that somewhere in the jungles around Angkor Wat, the locals had seen the creature they had carved into the walls.
That's what Eddie thought. Now I know most of you never met Eddie, but when he got a bee in his bonnet about something, he'd become obsessed. He insisted we go ask people. Locals who might know something about why that carving was there. I mean, nowadays it's a game. Visitors to the temples walk around looking for that particular carving. But back then, the question of how that image came to be there. Eddie couldn't let it go. He spends days talking to guides, some local historians, and even an American woman who was there doing some kind of zoological survey. It was the folks in one of the villages that convinced him, though. He had a kiddie's picture book of dinosaurs and a rubbing he'd taken from the wall of the stegosaur, and he showed it to this fella and his wife in one of the villages. Now, you've got to remember that this was 1980, and in some of these rural areas, things weren't all that developed. I'm not sure the folks we were talking to had running water in their homes, let alone books or televisions to have heard about this sort of stuff. But I'm telling you now, as soon as Edie showed them that picture, they knew what he was on about. I can't remember the name they gave it, but they all knew it. They said they recognized the animal, that it was very dangerous, and that it lived in the deep forest. According to them, this thing could kill buffalo with one swipe of its tail and made the ground shake when it walked. It was weird, because even though Eddie wanted more than anything to believe it was true, that there could be some kind of living dinosaur in the Cambodian jungle, he was totally dismissive of the people telling him about it. This is what I mean when I say the Morton attitude. The way he spoke to them was like he was the great enlightened white man, and they were, I don't know, primitive or uneducated or something. I wasn't a fan of it all. I remember looking at the villager's face whilst Eddie was trying his best, speaking English slowly so that you'll understand his voice, that it was impossible. This, I remember him saying, pointing to a picture of a stegosaurus, cannot, dead, impossible. You understand? Impossible. The villager shook his head, pointed to the picture, and then to the jungle that fringed his home, and which I have to admit by that time was looking far darker and more foreboding than it had when we'd approached. The villager also said that this creature was responsible for eating many men. That was Eddie's cue to laugh. He got a pen and paper out of his bag and tried to explain the idea of evolution to this poor chap who wasn't the least bit interested. Evolution, he kept saying, really slowly, like this villager was either hard of hearing or hard of understanding or both. This one is a plant eater. Vegetarian. No kill men, no kill animal. Plants. Evolution. The villager simply shook his head and continued pointing to the forest. It was about a week after that Eddie decided to go on his little expedition. He hired a guide, packed up a bunch of camping equipment and camera gear, and said he was going dinosaur hunting. If there is anything out there like that, then I'm going to photograph it and bring back the evidence. Can you imagine? A living dinosaur? He set out that morning. I never saw him again. Obviously, there were searches, investigations. A lot of folks thought that the guide simply did away with him and took his money and equipment, but I didn't buy that at all. About a week later, I went back to visit the villager Eddie had spoken to, and sure enough, he said that Eddie had been killed and eaten by the beast in the forest. When I tried to explain that this was impossible and that a stegosaurus was a herbivore, the villager smiled. He spoke for quite some time to an interpreter who then translated for me. "You think," he said, nodding politely, "that we don't know what evolution is? That we are backward and don't know science? I went to school for many years in the city. I know you're Darwin man, so let me tell you, your monster in your book, your stegosaurus, is a plant eater. It also died out 65 million years ago. If it's been here since then, in this jungle, it can change. 65 million years is more than enough time to grow some teeth and develop a taste for flesh." When the interpreter had finished, the villager again smiled broadly and nodded his head. "Evolution," he said quietly.
The idea that someone from Morton might patronize the locals and have a very outdated idea of what people in other places are like made sense. The idea that someone from Morton might have travelled to Cambodia and been consumed by some surviving dinosaur was ridiculous, outlandish, and downright stupid. The problem is, there's another aspect to the Morton mindset. If you live here long enough and see enough ridiculous, outlandish, and stupid stories turn out to be true, after a while you start to believe them the first time around.